Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Joel Jamieson, glad we made this one work. We had to reschedule a couple times, but it's good to have you back on. You've done a bunch of great episodes with me in the past, and you are I'm going to say a legendary strength and conditioning coach. You've worked with world champions in mixed martial arts, the UFC, including Demetrius Johnson. You are the founder of Morpheus. We could talk a little bit more about that. A lot of your stuff is on your website, 8 weeks out, and the certified conditioning coach certification. I've done it. I love it. The author of, I'm going to shout this out. I just had Jason Brown on. We were talking about it. Ultimate MMA Conditioning. This book is OG. It's great.
It is OG. It's old.
I know you're too busy doing an updated version, but it's amazing. But there's been a little bit of a shift recently in what you've been focusing on. So I want to dive into that, and I'll go right into it. Can you lift weights to a volume, duration, intensity where it may negatively impact your longevity?
Yeah, I think, look, if we zoom out to the big picture, I think there's a U-shaped curve on just about everything in life, and certainly fitness applies as well. I mean, we know that extreme levels of strength and force and power, if you look at powerlifters, they're trying to compete. They're trying to lift the biggest, heaviest loads possible. Now, if you look at guys who've been doing that their entire life, you look at their 50s and 60s, regardless of longevity standpoint, you often see them pretty beat up. You know, you see them with bad knees, bad backs, back shoulders. It takes its toll on the body. So I think, like anything else, you can do too much of strength training, you can do too much cardio, you can do too much anything just about. You can stretch yourself and cause muscle injuries if you're overstretching. So yeah, I think there's no doubt that if you do too much of anything in fitness and you go to the extreme, you can end up taking a toll on your body. And I think that's going to translate into overall health, your mobility, your longevity, your joints, and all that sort of stuff.
This episode is brought to you by Morpheus, not Lawrence Fishburne's character in The Matrix, but the recovery tracking hardware and app created by my friend Joel Jamieson, whose episode you're listening to. Joel is one of the world's leading authorities on heart rate variability and conditioning. Joel's course, Certified Conditioning Coach, is a game changer for any fitness professional. Meanwhile, Morpheus is the industry-leading system to give you the most accurate measure of HRV and uses it to calculate your personal recovery score and daily heart rate zones, seeing your fitness improve week after week by managing the balance between volume, intensity, and recovery. Morpheus takes out the guesswork and gives you training targets to hit each week. Cardio is more popular than ever, with interest in Zone 2 cardio, hybrid training at an all-time high. Morpheus is the best option for you to help with this. And I know Joel personally. We both presented at the 2024 Bigger Ground Fitness and Business Summit. I've seen him speak at many other events. I've done his certification, and I own and use Morpheus. This one is one of the easiest personal endorsements I can ever give. If you want to learn more, go to trainwithmorpheus.com. That's trainwithmorpheus.com. And I've seen you do a presentation on this. So what is sort of the research data pointing to in terms of, just how much? Because what you just said, and especially with the example of powerlifters, oftentimes we've got anabolic drugs. We have, they're carrying excess body weight as a whole, which is going to tax the heart. Sure. So that's going to be a portion of this. But with, the number of training sessions, maybe the hours a week, is there a point where we're not only seeing diminishing returns? I think we understand that, but an actual potential negative in the data.
Yeah. So what's interesting is there's been a few studies that come out. One fairly recently looked at over 400,000 people over a 10 to 15 year period. And essentially what they do is it's an observational study, meaning they ask people in the beginning of the study what their lifting habits are, how frequently they train, all that sort of stuff. And then they follow them for a number of years, and then they follow up to see how many people are still alive, more or less. And then they run a bunch of correlative analysis and see if there's any differences in people lived longer or shorter, were alive or not alive, and then look at their different responses to these surveys. And what you see, and this is not just one study, I'm mentioning one study, but there's been a few like this. What you tend to see is there's a sweet spot where people that do somewhere between 2 to 3 sessions a week, they tend to be associated with be more likely to be alive at the end of the study. In other words, they tend to have greater mortality and reduction in diseases. And then when you start going to the 4, 5, and 6 sessions a week, you tend to see in some people those numbers seem to kind of plateau, and in some people those numbers seem to go the wrong direction, and their longevity gets worse. Maybe not worse than doing nothing, but worse than doing that 2 to 3 sessions per week. Now, again, it's important to point out these are observational correlative studies. We can't ever really say like, oh, this person lifting weights 6 days a week was a causative factor in why their longevity was reduced. We just don't have enough information to make those statements. But it is interesting to see that people that are, doing 4, 5, 6 sessions a week are seeing less longevity and reductions in those, in the benefits than the people who are doing 2 to 3. So why that is, could it be genetics? Could it be something that people are lifting 6 days a week are doing? I mean, I doubt it's drugs because you're talking 400 plus thousand people in these studies. So
Mm.
I don't think there'd be enough of that to make that big a difference. It could be diet, could be who knows? There could be lots of variables in there. But I do think it's safe to say, at least in my personal opinion, that if your goal is to maximize your health and longevity, I don't think more than 2 or 3 sessions a week is really necessary. I think we probably do max out the benefits in that 2 to 3 range. And this is not just research, this is me coaching for 20 plus years. And I think part of that is if you're lifting 4, 5, 6 days a week, how much cardio are you really doing? And we know how important the cardiovascular system is to develop. We know how important VO2 max, all these sorts of things are hugely important. And if you're lifting 6 days a week, you're either not doing very much cardio or you're not recovering if you are. So that's the other big picture here is we know that 2 or 3 sessions a week of lifting with whatever cardio it takes to build your VO2 max as high as you can get it seems to be the recipe for success as far as we see in the research. And I would say as far as I've seen in coaching as well.
This episode is brought to you by Renaissance Periodization and the RP Hypertrophy app. RP is the industry leader in muscle building, coaching, and education. This app is like having a coach in your pocket. It gives you everything you need, including training programs, form videos. It gives you all your sets, reps, and weights, so you just show up and follow the plan. It adjusts each week based off your progress. And the app was created by Dr. Mike Isertel, Nick Shaw, and the team at RP, who I've known for many years. And the entire team are incredible people who've always been supportive and generous with me, so I know their character and are easy to endorse. My library contains several RP books, and I've used RP training principles in my workouts and coaching with my clients for many years, long before the explosion in popularity of their YouTube channel, which is worth checking out. RP is the first sponsor I felt remotely comfortable endorsing after over 7 years of podcasting. And if hiring a one-on-one coach isn't for you, using the RP Hypertrophy app is the next best thing to maximize your gains and take the guesswork out of your program. And there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free. If you don't like it, they'll give you your money back. And I've also got a serious discount for you of up to $50 US. Go to rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP, or go to the link below in the show notes. And that's rpstrength.com/coats. Use the code COATSRP.
Because that was going to be my next question is what is 5 to 6 days of working out a week crowding out? Cardio be one thing. And I can say this from personal experience too. How much positive social interaction are we losing too? Because I mean, you can look at I like citing the kind of the data on the blue zone stuff. And I think one of the misinterpretations of the blue zone research or interpretations on it is that, well, it's the type of diet these people are eating. And there's widely varied diets across different geographic regions. But one of the things that seems to be a strong thing across all these different regions is a lot of the eating is communal. It's family based. There's a big emphasis on that. But there's a lot of social stuff. And these people also tend to be in warmer climates where they tend to walk a lot and they're outdoors a lot more. But I would say the social factor, and I can say if I'm in the gym 6 days a week working out, the time it takes, guess what? That does crowd out social interaction.
Life. Yeah, it's really interesting because if you look at data in the US, the state that lives the longest is Hawaii, which I lived in Hawaii, and I can tell you that it is a very different culture than the mainland in terms of family and social status. It's obviously nice weather. People are outside, they're walking more. But if you go to Hawaii, you look at the natives, you don't see a picture of health physically. Like there's definitely plenty of overweight Hawaiians, and the food there is definitely not the healthiest. There's a lot of spam musubi and fried cutlets and pork. Like it is not what you would picture as a healthy diet, quote unquote. But there's no denying that people in Hawaii, specifically people that are born in Hawaii, live longer than any other state in the country. And I would argue they probably have the best social connections. They probably have, the best combination of having weather to be outside the year round. And, there's a very strong relationship there, I think. So it's a good example of what you're saying. It's not always, just the things we can look at in terms of diet or exercise. It's all these other intangibles that are a part of it too that we often don't measure.
So how much cardio do you really want someone to do in order to, let's say, optimize, improve their
Sure.
odds of positive longevity and quality of life?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the research here is pretty clear. If we again we can't say causality, but we see these correlations where there doesn't seem to be a decrease in benefit the more you build a VO2 max. Again, some of that could be genetics. People who have a very high VO2 max probably have genetic advantages across the board. And maybe other people can't even develop that VO2 max no matter how much they train to do. But what you do see, this is kind of a broad range number here. If you dig into volumes and different things, somewhere between 2 and 5 hours a week seems to be kind of again, it's a range of a sweet spot. It's 3 hours there, but 2 to 5 hours a week seems to be where the vast majority of people are going to get the vast majority of benefit. It doesn't mean that some people can't do more than that and see an additional benefit, but I think could be diminishing returns at that point. It doesn't mean that people are going to see no benefit from doing less than 2 hours. They certainly can, depending where they're at. But somewhere, again, in that 2 to 5 hours per week of total cardio, I'm not talking about high intensity. I'm not talking about low intensity. I'm just talking about 2 to 5 hours a week of getting some form of cardiovascular exercise combined with 2 to 3 strength training sessions per week, in my mind, really is the sweet spot for 95+% of the population. They're going to find some combination of those numbers provide them the best overall benefit at the least overall cost, and they're going to feel better. They're going to be as protected as possible against various diseases, and they need to be recovered from it, obviously, but those aren't excessive amounts like you would see an endurance athlete or strength athlete, those sorts of things.
We hear all sorts of talk now about VO2 max. How trainable is it? Because I've heard some suggestions that it's not necessarily that easy to train or adjust, and there's certainly genetic factors in
Sure.
play there. And is VO2 max itself the causal driver of longevity, or is it probably more a proxy of a cluster of behaviors, health promoting
Yeah,
behaviors?
those are good questions. So, I mean, I think first of all, how genetic is VO2? I've seen it described across the range, probably 40 something percent, but again, when we talk about genetics, we're talking about a bell curve for the most part. So the majority of people are going to be somewhere in the middle, and smaller percentages are way out towards the end, and then fewer people are way towards the other direction, right? So the vast majority of people can develop their VO2 to a pretty significant degree. There are certainly people who are going to have a very hard time doing it, and there's people who are going to have a very high VO2 doing basically nothing because they just have extremely good genetics for it. But the majority of people are going to fall somewhere in that range. And again, the interesting thing about VO2 is when we measure VO2, we're talking about the top end. Like we're talking about the maximum aerobic horsepower, you will, of that system, the maximum of oxygen you can put through your body. And I would say that number itself isn't the main driver, but it's the overall aerobic system development, the overall aerobic system efficiency that is a big part of the driver of a healthy metabolism. And a healthy metabolism is very important for longevity. And I think there is, that connection there. There's also no doubt there are like genetics, like I mentioned, but there are, of course, people that are doing VO2 max training are more likely to be eating healthier. They're more likely to be probably getting better sleep in general. They're more likely to have, just a healthier life if they have the time to exercise versus someone who's stressed out of their mind and working 60 hours a week. So there are certainly supporting factors that I'm sure play a role in that longevity benefit. But look, at the end of the day, our metabolism is aerobic, what we run on 24/7. It's what's driving the stress response, the recovery from the stress response, our ability to adapt to the world around us. It's what's delivering the vast majority of our energy through our lives. So there's no doubt that building that system and making it more efficient, making it more capable is going to have a net benefit on our ability to live a longer, healthier life.
Okay. Um, how much does this combination of strength training and cardio have an impact on some of the lifestyle diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes? Because these diseases are going to be baked into the longevity,
Yeah, of course.
statistics very heavily. So how much of this is the
Yeah.
influence on,
So
preventative? Yeah.
sure. I mean, so if you figure that roughly a third, maybe slightly over 1/3 of the population in the U.S. will die of cardiovascular disease and stroke, right? That's a third, right? That's a huge number. Like 1 out of 3 people, actually slightly over 1 out of 3 people, will die from cardiovascular disease. So if you're trying to improve longevity, that really is the single most important thing that you want to try to prevent, right? That's just reducing that significantly automatically increases your odds of living a longer life because it's such a deadly thing. After that, you have cancer and a bunch of other diseases down the road. But cardiovascular disease is something that we know how to prevent, or at least we have good indications of how to prevent. When we know cardiovascular exercise plays a huge role in that. Strength training, I would say less of a role. If you look at the numbers, it's anywhere from like 5% reduction to maybe 10% reduction maximum in cardiovascular disease. But we look at the combination of strength training and cardiovascular disease, we see anywhere from a 30 to 40% reduction, sometimes greater than that in cardiovascular disease. Cancer really depends on the papers you're looking at, 10%, 20% reduction in cancer. We see reductions in dementia, Alzheimer's, those sorts of things as well. And again, the common denominator here is if you're doing something healthy to build the aerobic system, you're doing something to build your bone density, your muscle mass, your metabolic health, all these things work together. So, again, I think if you take it as a whole, if you do everything you need to do, you do that somewhere between 2 and 5 hours a week of cardio, you get in 2 to 3 sessions of lifting, we can significantly reduce your all-cause mortality by, again, 30 to 40%. And probably more than that, I would say, actually, the cardiovascular side, if you've optimized everything from a diet, sleep, and everything else. So we have a big chance to reduce a lot of this stuff. But I will point out that doesn't mean the chances go to zero. There is still risk, right? Even if you reduce it by half, you still have a risk. And so we do have to be diligent about screening and testing and making sure that we're not thinking that because we're in the gym and we're doing the right things that we're impervious to this stuff. We aren't. People still get cardiovascular disease. I have blocks in my own heart after a year. I have very, very bad genetics, unfortunately, but we have to be aware that fitness and exercise and health and diet and sleep are the most powerful weapons we have. And they're going to do a huge amount of good for us. So they're gonna do everything they can. But we still have to be diligent and pay attention to monitoring ourselves and getting screened and checked and all that sort of stuff.
I'll add a note, and I recently had a friend of mine who's a PhD in cancer biology named Dr. Joe Zundell. If anybody wants that, just message me. I'll send you the episode. But especially when it comes to surviving cancer, the more muscle you have, that means the more reserve you have, because oftentimes cancer and cancer treatment can be pretty devastating on your muscle mass. So if you start with more, you have a steeper hill of which you can still lose some and yet survive it. And in some cases, it's not even the disease that kind of takes people out. It's the fact that they just don't have the muscle mass to be able to survive the treatment. And we see something very similar when it comes to neurodegenerative disease, because strength training and movement, I like to think about as motor skill, the strength of the nervous system's ability to move. And so what erodes when it comes to neurodegenerative, especially with something like Parkinson's, a lot of that is motor skill. So the more reserve we have, the more of I guess, how do I want to say this?
Buffer.
Yeah, exactly, right? A buffer, so that way you have a longer hill to kind of slide down before you end up at a position where it really severely impacts you. So
yeah, real quick here. The biggest thing about that I would say is our muscle mass is what moves us around, right? We need to be able to move as human beings. It is central to our lives to be active and moving, not just for the principle of moving, but again, going back to social relationships, going back to doing the things that we enjoy doing that make us happy. When we lose the ability to move, whether it's because we're going through chemotherapy and cancer, or we have some other neurodegenerative disease, when we lose the movement in our lives, we wither and die. There's no two ways about it. And having watched my mom go through a stroke and having lung disease and all these things, when she lost the capacity to really move and do the things she enjoyed, her will to live just melted away, because it was not a happy life and she was not happy living it, because she was confined to a room for a lot of her time, and that's a horrible thing. So muscle mass is the thing that we use to move us around. The aerobic system is what powers all of that movement and allows us to contract and relax our muscles and get the energy to all of our cells. And you need both. You need the strength training to build that muscle mass, to build the strength to support movement, and then you need the energetic side to drive that capacity.
And this transitions perfectly. You referenced your own genetics. You referenced what happened to your mom. So you are renowned for being the energy systems and conditioning guy. You work with these elite athletes in the UFC and otherwise, but you've really been focusing now more on longevity and quality of life. So, why the shift?
Well, yeah, I mean, number one, I'm 45 now, so your perspective and everything changes as you age. And I've been monitoring my own data for a long time, and just seeing how the body changes over time is a big important factor. And like I mentioned, my mom, I watched her have a stroke, and she had a lung disease called sarcoidosis. She had heart disease. I had stents put in for that. and then she had breast cancer. And over a 10-year period, like I said, her quality of life was just obliterated. She was a flight attendant before she had the stroke. She traveled all the time. She loved to travel, was very adventurous, and would frequently go out and do all kinds of crazy stuff, and just loved being out. And she's also a very social person. And then, through the process of all that, she was, really, like I said, kind of confined to her room at the end of her last few years in a retirement community. And then the worst of all, I think the thing that actually kind of finally did her in is COVID, not in the way that, COVID didn't kill her directly. She fortunately didn't get COVID, but she was basically in a retirement community and they were just confined to their rooms. There was no more social events. There was no more eating in the dining room. Like, all their social stuff was just gone. And I understand, why. But unfortunately, she lived in a bedroom, a 1-bedroom apartment for a couple of years and barely moved at all. And her weight went from like 100 to like 92 or even upper 180 or 80s. She just wasn't exercising. She wasn't moving. She was getting very little social stimulation. And that just, unfortunately was the nail in the coffin, and she didn't make it after that. So, that's seeing someone go through that's very traumatizing. And I would love to do anything to prevent other people from having to watch their mom or their dad or their relatives go through that. And of course, want to prevent them going through that themselves. So I think just as important, we look at performance as a really important factor when we're in our 20s, but performance when we're 60s to 70s is just being able to get up out of bed, enjoy ourselves, and go about our day without disease or disability. So, I want to take the tools and the things I've learned over my career and help everybody live that healthy, long life, because I've seen what happens when you don't, and it's not good.
One of the things I've been doing with these episodes is trying to build topic-based episodes. So I have one that goes really in depth about aging adults, like training older adults, maintaining bone mineral density, muscle mass, and prevention of fall risk, and all these things we just talked about. And that's with Robert Linkle. So guys, again, if you guys are interested, scroll back or message me. I'll give you that episode, because I want to build this resource library. Okay, so are there any other lifestyle interventions that you tend to focus on that there's good evidence that they're also helping reduce the lifestyle disease risk, improve longevity? And that could be, certainly you mentioned nutrition. Dare I even ask supplements, because that's obviously a very contentious thing, or even exposure to anything in the environment?
Yeah, look, I think the big ones, of course, are stress. Your mental stress, I think, is a huge part of this, because we turn on that stress response system throughout our lives. And obviously we need to be able to do that to have an effective response to the world around us. But when we overactivate it and our blood pressure is elevated and our sympathetic system's turned on throughout the day because we're mentally stressed out, that accumulates, and that causes a lot of inflammation, a lot of damage across the years. And I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle. Sleep is obviously a big factor, and it's tied to that. If you're constantly stressed out, your sleep's going to suffer as a result, and it's all going to work together negatively. And then obviously nutrition. Those are really the big three, other than exercise. You need to be able to get high quality sleep. You need to have a good, reasonable diet that gives you enough protein and the right amount of calories and enough vitamins and minerals and everything else for your metabolism to work correctly. And then you just need to put the pieces all together. That's what it comes down to. If you're missing one huge piece, it can be a roadblock to getting the benefits of everything else. So if you're training hard, you're eating well, but your sleep is terrible, well, now you're not going to get the same benefit from sleep. And actually, they're all, again, connected, because what happens when our sleep is really bad? Well, we tend to be more likely to eat poor foods and make poor food choices, or we tend to be more likely to skip the gym because we're tired. So these things all work together. Your lifestyle is not these separate silos. I would say they're all very integrated and closely, tied together, because they all come back to the body's ability to create energy and use that energy. And again, the more you can put sleep and nutrition and mental stress and training and align them all so that they're all working together, you're recovering from your exercise, you're getting good quality sleep, eating the right foods to support recovery and building muscle and all these things. That is the key. It really comes down to putting those pieces together in a way that they all work together rather than half of them are working against you.
And I want to do a separate and very in-depth episode on heart rate variability. You're also one of the world's leading authorities on heart rate variability. You were on Peter Attia's podcast discussing this, and you developed, your Morpheus system, which measures it. So at least, do you want to give at least a little bit of an introduction into how heart rate variability can measure your stress?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about stress, what we're talking about, again, when people think about stress, you might think about different things, but from a physiological standpoint, we're talking about the body turning up that sympathetic nervous system, which most people would think of as the fight or flight system. And that system's job, like it sounds, is to prepare the body for fight or flight. That means turning up energy production. It means turning down digestion. It puts the body on the immune system in high alert. It can be pro-inflammatory. It makes us more alert, more aware. It's like it sounds. It's like fight or flight. And then we have this other side of our body, of the autonomic nervous system, called the parasympathetic nervous system. And it works to basically reverse a lot of those processes. So it's anabolic. It's more about storing energy and putting energy back after you burned it off. And it's about recovery, regeneration, growth, repair, all these sorts of things. And so these two systems work together as the autonomic nervous system. Their job is to respond to the stress of the world around you and help you adapt to it so it's less stressful down the road. So give you a big example here. Let's say I do a big workout. Okay, I need more energy for that workout. My sympathetic system, it's important to think of it like a dial, not like an on-off switch. And so our sympathetic nervous system cranks up so that we can produce more energy. It releases cortisol. We get more blood glucose. Our heart can beat more forcefully. Our muscles contract more forcefully because we have adrenaline and noradrenaline in our bloodstream. This is all sympathetic. This is the stress response, right? We have a physiological response to a stressor in the real world. We're lifting weights or we're doing cardio, whatever. That's a stressor. It's causing our body to have to create more energy. And then, okay, workout's over. Now that dial has to come back down. The sympathetic system is going to start dialing it back because you don't need the energy anymore. And then at the same time, your parasympathetic system at some point can start dialing that dial up so it can put the energy back and promote growth, repair, regeneration, all that sort of stuff. And this is happening over and over again throughout your day, throughout your lifetime, depending on what you're doing. Now, the problem, like I said, is if you are sitting there thinking about something very stressful, whether it's job or kids or finances, whatever it is, your heart rate's slightly elevated, your sympathetic system slightly up, you're activating that stress response.
I'm going to give it a funny example. Okay, so I trained two clients earlier today, and they both came in and they both had been sleeping well recently. They both were feeling like kind of stressed out, and neither was clear on this, but I explained to them. So there's two things going on right now as the time of this recording. We just had a big election, a federal election in Canada, and a lot of people, it's a very stressful thing. And so the funny thing is the two clients, each of them was very emotionally invested in the outcome, just on opposite sides. And two, they're both Edmonton Oilers fans. The Oilers are currently in the first round of the playoffs, and they were down 2 games, and they some nail biters, and they came back, and now they're up 3-2. So everybody that I know that is a diehard Oilers fan is their blood pressure has been through the roof. Plus, they're staying up late watching the hockey games, and they're having a drink watching these games. So sleep's interfered with. There's alcohol in play, and they don't even realize like why they're feeling pretty run down. And that alone, right there, has a very strong response from the sympathetic nervous system.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's suppressing. So you gotta remember when that sympathetic dial is turned up, it means that parasympathetic system is generally turned down. And remember, that's the recovery, growth, repair, regeneration, digestion, all those sorts of things. So if I do a big workout, the only way I'm going to recover from that workout, and not just recover, but adapt and get stronger or faster or more aerobically efficient or whatever, the only way that's going to happen is if that parasympathetic system drives energy into those different tissues that need repair and regeneration. If I'm spending a bunch of time in the sympathetic state, I'm not getting good sleep, which is where a huge percentage of recovery happens, then the gains aren't going to happen. So we can't take it as a foregone conclusion that just because we train that there's this instant and guaranteed response where the body gets better or sees results. It doesn't happen unless the body has the energy driven into recovery, repair, regeneration. So a big piece of this is to understand there are two sides to that equation. So back to HRV, what we're measuring with HRV is the activation of that parasympathetic nervous system. And we are measuring it at rest. We're looking at the resting state, and that's where the body's managing it, because when we're really active, we're up moving around, that sympathetic dial is turned up, the HRV is very, very low. It's not super valuable to measure that. It would just show you that you're moving around, you're doing something. So we measure it in a resting state. There's wearables that do it overnight. I think it's a much better, more accurate tool to do it in the mornings. So you're getting a baseline comparative state each day, the same way you would as if you were measuring for weight change. You'd want to measure yourself first thing in the morning to see where you're at each day to get the same context. But that's basically telling us how these two systems are interacting with each other and how your body is interacting with the world around you. And we look at two things. What is the number, that baseline number each day? That tells us your baseline parasympathetic activity, and people with higher baseline parasympathetic activity have higher aerobic fitness in general. They tend to be more stress resilient. They tend to have, again, greater longevity because they're better at managing stress. If you have a much lower number, it tends to be indicative of the opposite. You tend to be more likely to be slower to recover. You tend to be less resilient. You tend to have more problems and probably more inflammation. Those things all add up to a negative consequence. So we look at that. What's the baseline number and how is that changing over time? And then you look at the volatility. In other words, how much is that changing on a daily basis? Because that is swinging up and down in response to what you're doing. If you're seeing big, huge changes in either direction of the number, it's telling you that your body's under a lot of stress. And again, the thing is, we can't tell you from HRV exactly what the stressor is because stress is cumulative and it's all adds together. It's not this individual compartmentalized thing where the body responds totally differently to lifting weights versus sitting there being stressed out at the TV or politics or sports or whatever. Stress is in a big part a generalized response. That sympathetic system turns on the same way, and there's differences, but broadly speaking, turns on very similarly to an election stressful event as it does to a workout, just at different degrees. So we can't look at HRV and say, oh, this person's HRV did this because of X, Y, or Z. It's because of the totality of everything that happened in the last 24 to 48 hours. But it tells us, again, how volatile that is, gives us a really good indication of whether or not your body is responding very strongly, in which case you're under a lot of stress, or it's stable, in which case it's not having to. And so with that information, again, we'll talk about this more next time, I'm sure, but with that information, you can make better decisions about your workouts, about your sleep, about your diet, about all those sorts of things, because the more stress you're under for a longer period of time, the more likely you are to have increased risk of all these diseases, because stress is, like it sounds, it's stressful in the body, and that adds up over time. And you want to use stress in a positive way through exercise and these things to build our body's resilience and its capacity to recover and adapt, rather than letting all the stress wear your body down into oblivion, where you're damaging your DNA and your cells and you're accelerating the aging process. And I would say that's what it comes down to. We can either accelerate the aging process or we can decelerate the aging process. That's what we're trying to do through diet and exercise and everything else, is decelerate that process by making our body more resilient. And that's what slows down diseases and death and everything else. It doesn't, like, we're not stopping them. We still get diseases and die and people exercise, but they happen much later in life. And that's why we live longer lives, because we're more resilient.
Are there any guardrails that you like to put in place, you personally, the athletes that you're working with, where they may be really pushing the red line on the stress? And I like the concept of allostatic load, the total, load of
Sure.
stress where it's experiencing. And you mentioned recovery a few times, because it's not like allostatic load is this constant thing. It's always going to be influenced because it changes because of how much you can recover and sleep and everything else. And if influences that, you can create a deficit there. So are there any guardrails, especially for the person who might be high stress, their HRV score is poor, and yet their answer is to go crush themselves in the weight room when they're feeling stressed out?
Yeah, I think that just comes down to awareness and education. They either don't understand that they're as crushed as they are, they're just so used to it, it becomes their normal, or they don't necessarily understand the negative effects of continuing to dig themselves in a hole when they're already in a hole. So a lot of times that just comes down to, again, education and getting people to understand. In the big picture, exercise should make you feel good. Most of the time you walk out of the gym, like, sure, you should feel a bit tired, but you should feel good. You shouldn't walk out of the gym feeling just absolutely crushed very often. And if you look at that as a marker of the workout, it kind of changes your perspective, because if you think that the goal of the workout is to walk out destroyed, then you're probably going to not want to do anything except destroy yourself every time you go to the gym. If you think the workout should make you feel better, or at least pretty good when you walk out, then it's a paradigm shift. And certainly some people you need to have those conversations with. Some people, data becomes a really big help because they start to actually see their HRV getting worse over time, and that should be a big bright illumination of what they're doing wrong, and help them hopefully identify and make behavioral decisions that are different so they don't see that. But everyone's a little bit different. You kind of have to work with what someone's psychology is, and what's the right approach to getting them to understand the goal of exercise, which is to make your body more resilient, not just to beat your body into the ground every day.
Are there any warning signs? Again, I openly encourage, I think Morpheus is excellent, but are there any other warning signs that people can just like be attuned to if they see changes in things?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that hard. It's how do you feel, right? Do you have a good amount of energy every day? Are you getting a good amount of sleep, or are you having nagging aches and pains as you're lifting or as you're recovering? Like, it's not too difficult to figure out how you broadly feel. And like I said, a lot of times these people, you have conversations with the people that are type A, they just want to crush themselves. Like, how do you feel? Like, oh yeah, I'm a little bit tired. Well, how's your sleep been? Yeah, it hasn't been great. Oh, well, how's your shoulder doing lately? Oh, yeah, hasn't been feeling very good. Like, when you start actually digging into people's things, like they just kind of accept these things are normal to them because they've just kind of gotten used to them, and you kind of have to shake them out of it. Like, no, these things are not normal. You shouldn't feel tired. Another one would be sex drive. If you have no sex drive, that's a good indication. If you're getting sick more often, that's a good indication. There's all kinds of warning signs of things that are going wrong that you just kind of have to get people to pay attention to them or admit to themselves that these are things that can be changed. These aren't just like the normal process of going through their day. You should have a good amount of energy. You should be able to fall asleep at night and stay asleep. You shouldn't have nagging aches or pains or injuries. Like, you should have normal appetite, normal sex drive. All those things, should be within a normal range that, you're aware of being normal, not just like shitty all the time.
So does it matter how you allocate your time for strength training and cardio? Because we're circling back a little bit. As long as you're doing them and in proximity to each other, are you worried about that for the average person?
For the average person, no. The one thing I'll say is cardiovascular work, aerobic work, needs more frequency. So if you said, oh, I want to get in 2 hours a week, the answer to that wouldn't be to do 2 hours every Friday and then nothing the rest of the week. Like, sure, that would meet the requirement in the low end, but you need frequency of stimulation. The body needs, mitochondria needs, the heart needs, it needs to be stimulated more frequently than strength training. So I would say your average human being, twice a week of a total body workout is enough for most people to make some pretty significant gains. Like, they'll hit a plateau eventually, but I think that plateau will be pretty far down the road of a good amount of strength compared to sedentary people. Cardiovascular wise, twice a week is probably not going to get you nearly as far on the aerobic side as it will on the strength side. You just need to do it more frequently, even if that means less volume per day, which it generally often does. So I think as long as you can get in your aerobic work, I would say, 3 times a week is better than two, but 4 times a week is better than three. And then, you get in a couple strength training sessions. Maybe you want to spend time at doing 3 sessions a week, or maybe every once in a while you bump that up. I don't think this has to be static either, I would say. Like, you don't have to always have the exact same focus. When you're first getting into this, everything will improve for a good amount of time. And then there comes a period where you have to start focusing your efforts. So maybe you decide you're going to spend 3 to 4 months and really focus on that VO2 and that aerobic side, and you dial the strength train back to twice a week so you have more time to recover and do the aerobic work, and that gets cranked up. Maybe you see a nice big increase in every time. Now you decide you want to add a little bit more muscle, you want to add a little bit more strength. Maybe you dial the aerobic side back and you add an extra day or two of lifting. This doesn't have to be a set in stone static thing that you just follow, robotically for the rest of your life. You can vary these things, but yeah, I think in general, frequency becomes the dominating factor in aerobic work, and more volume is more important as you get better. And strength training, 2 or 3 sessions a week for the average person is going to do the trick for the vast majority of them, unless you really get to a high level and you want to keep pushing things even further, which, more power to you. But yeah, I think that would be my big picture there.
How important is it to have an adaptive stimulus for your cardio? So if you think about resistance training, we're generally talking about progressive overload. So if you're not training to near failure, if you're not progressively adding, some aspect of intensity, volume, load, whatever combination works. And so we've got people, obviously, there's arguments sometimes about whether walking is cardio. I think we all know that walking is just simply wonderful for us, but you get the person who's sedentary and starts walking. And then short duration walking is actually very challenging. So therefore, it's a very adaptive stimulus. But you get to someone who has a pretty high VO2 max, who can handle long bouts, durations of cardio. Is there an intensity or a total workload that we need to hit in order to improve? Or is it
Well,
all
yeah,
just
look,
good?
no, I mean, it's good, but everything comes down to the body in order for the body to adapt and get stronger, more efficient, whatever the case may be, it has to be pushed slightly beyond its current capabilities. Otherwise, it doesn't need to adapt. And that's something I think people don't understand a lot of times, because they look at HRV and they do a hard workout and like, oh, my HRV didn't move. I'm like, well, okay, first of all, the workout is just one piece of your day. The second of all, how many times have you done that workout? Oh, I've been doing this workout for 3 months. Well, yeah, it didn't move because your body is used to this workout. It can still be hard, but the body has already adapted to it. And the question I always ask is, well, how much stronger have you gotten in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks? Oh, I've kind of plateaued. Well, yeah, you've plateaued, meaning the body's not getting better because it's not being pushed to get better, which is why your HRV is not moving as part of that response because, it's not just effort, it's more effort in the right direction that causes your body to have to get better. And the same thing applies to every area of fitness. The body's not going to adapt unless it's pushed to adapt. It has to respond to it in a way that leads to it being better. So cardiovascular wise, we have the same levers as we do on the strength training side. We have volume and intensity, and then you can throw frequency in there as part of volume. So you have to be constantly looking at how do I increase the load on the body. It can be adding volume, doing a few more minutes per exercise or per workout. I mean, you could be doing more frequency, which is also more weekly volume, and you can be doing more intensity. You pull those levers in whatever manner is most appropriate for where you're at, but you have to always be pushing the body further by doing something that's causing the body to have to adapt versus just if you do the same thing every workout, every day, every month, every year, like you're just going to kind of maintain where you're at. But if you never change anything, you never progressively overload yourself, then nothing's going to change. So that's the principle I would say applies to literally every aspect of training, fitness.
And I like highlighting that because you get the people who will just kind of do the same thing. And, again, there's value in being active and the maintenance. It's not all just in the adaptive side. There's probably a very positive
Absolutely.
effect on your mental health. There's a lot of good there. But if someone wants to improve, they have to find ways to make sure the stimulus is progressively more challenging.
Yeah, it's the same thing as like, okay, I eat a certain amount of calories and I plateau and then I just keep eating those calories. My body weight is not going to keep going down. Like that's where my body's settled in at. So I would just say in general, there's definitely periods where you want to stabilize. I think that's a bit underrated. So yeah, I do want to make clear progress for a little while. And then I'll have a period where I'm just trying to maintain that and just stabilize those changes. And then I'll go into another period of trying to make progress. But yeah, you can't assume the body's going to continue to get better without some sort of change. But the problem I see a lot of times is when people get stuck or they get frustrated, sometimes it's just like they try to throw everything out and do something totally new. I think that's CrossFit in a nutshell. Like you can't just have random stimulus all the time or random changes. Like, yeah, that's more stressful to the body because it's never done it before, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's pushing the body in the right direction. So you have to understand the levers of volume, intensity, frequency, and then even exercise to some extent have to be used intelligently, not just like, oh, this workout's not doing anything for me anymore. I'm just going to do something completely different. Like, I don't know, maybe that completely different will do something, but that doesn't necessarily mean it'll push you where you're trying to go. You have to have a little more targeted, focused increases than just throw it all out the window and try something different.
Shots at CrossFit, right? All right. We're like I said, we'll come back and we'll talk much more in depth about heart rate variability and Morpheus. But for now, people can find you on Instagram at Coach Joel Jamieson, and it is not spelt like the Irish whiskey. It's
Nope.
Jamieson. So don't screw that up,
Yep.
guys.
I don't
Are there
think
any
there
other?
is. I'm pretty sure it's not a Coach Joel James spelled the wrong way, but I don't know if you'll find me that way either.
Yeah, they shouldn't have any trouble. I follow you, so that's easy enough, right? You'll show up if you follow me.
Yep.
What other resources do you want to point people to?
Just 8weeksout.com, like you mentioned, and trainwithmorpheus.com. Those are the best places to find all my stuff. If you want to learn more about the stress response and kind of stuff we've talked about, I would say look up Robert Sapolsky. I always really like to give him a shout out. I think he's an amazing teacher, amazing scientist. And if you want to learn all things stress response, human behavior biology, he's got a free course on YouTube that is his entire Stanford behavior biology course. And he's just a genius, in my opinion. So if you want to have a kind of a big picture understanding of how the body reacts to the world around it from a stress standpoint, Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, is still a fantastic read. It's been a while since it's been out, but it's absolutely fantastic as well. So I would point anyone to his work and his resources that really just want to dial in their understanding of stress and how it impacts us on a physiological level.
Absolutely. I think there's another book that's worth complimenting as well. I recommend The Upside of Stress, and I believe it's she's a PhD named McGonigal. It's been a while since I've read it, and she actually gets into how we tend to think of stress as bad, like the word just indicates bad, when in fact there's a lot of complexity to the situation and a sense of control over your own outcome can actually be a major mitigator of a sense of stress and the negative outcomes associated with stress. So I love that book too. But yeah, go read Sapolsky's book. And again, everybody, I openly endorse Joel. I've done your certification. I've read your book. Your stuff's really good. That's why I brought you on here. So I want people to dive into that. Do you have any speaking events coming up? I know Luca's not doing Vigor Summit this year, but are you going to be appearing anywhere?
Oh yeah, I'm doing one up in August in Canada at the CanFit Pro, I believe it is.
Oh,
Um,
you're gonna be physically there because I'll be there.
yeah.
Luca's gonna be there. Jason
Yep.
Brown, who I
Yep.
just had on, we talked a little bit about you.
Yeah.
So I will see you
Speaking
there.
to that one. Yep.
Oh
I'll be there.
shit.
Good.
Okay.
Good life. I think we're doing stuff with them, but yeah,
Yeah.
I'll be up there in August.
Well, shit. If I remember correctly, I'm the one who linked you up with Eric Wonkaiput, who's part of that. So I'm glad that manifested out into a relationship with Good Life. They're great. And so, yeah, I will absolutely see you there. So anybody listening, guys, come to CanFit Pro. There'll be a whole bunch of us there doing presentations. So,
Yep.
Joel, I
Sounds good.
appreciate you, man. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate your time.
No problem. Glad to be on. I'm sure we'll talk in soon.